Hello and welcome to this lens tutorial from Canon. I'm Rob Crow, this is Jenny Hare. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at portrait photography. So how do we define a portrait? Well, to one person it might mean something quite formal, eyes straight to camera, head and shoulders, whilst to someone else it might be a more casual shot, maybe a candid shot caught in an event. What we're really talking about here is photographing people, and people are an endlessly fascinating subject. Good photography communicates, it suggests narrative, it tells stories. So can a portrait tell a story? Well, yes, it can, and it could come from maybe the strength in someone's expression or a bit of vulnerability in the eyes, or perhaps we could capture a real moment of connection between two people. There's no reason those two people couldn't be the photographer and the subject, and if you let your viewer in on a moment like that, you've got a really powerful image. So how can something as seemingly mechanical as a lens influence a process as subtle as this? Well, it can do it in a number of ways. Focal length is going to have an influence on how close we stand to our subjects, and that's obviously going to have an effect on the sort of images that we make. Another thing is the aperture, the speed of the lens. A really fast aperture is going to let us work longer, later, into lower light, perhaps catch some moments that we wouldn't otherwise. And then the focusing mechanism can have an influence. These lenses have USM motors, they focus really fast, very quietly, so that's really useful as well. If we look at a lens like this 50mm f1.4 lens, it's very fast, and because of its simple construction, which is common to most primes, it means in a way there's less between us and the world. Most photographers should have a 50mm, and the reason for that is that's the kind of focal length that gives us a very natural field of view, very similar to our own. And that brings us to this, the 85 f1.2. Now, 85mm focal length is a really nice length for portraiture. It renders faces very naturally, brings us a little bit further back than the 50, but that's a really good thing. Now, 1.2, that's a really wide aperture. You can see that this lens can let in an awful lot of light. We often talk about lenses in terms of their sharpness, but it's equally important how they render the soft parts of an image. There's even a word for it, bokeh. It's Japanese for fuzzy. But it's a very important aspect of a lens and how it draws the image on our sensor. If we are working at an event or at a wedding, maybe we need a little more flexibility to really work quickly and grab those candid portraits. Something like this 17 to 55 EFS lens is a really useful range. Again, on an APS-C camera with its 1.6 crop factor, that's around a 28 to 90mm range. Again, at the long end, lovely for portraits, natural perspective, but the wide end just helps us out in those moments where maybe we're a little squashed up and we can't quite get far enough back, need to grab a shot. But let's have a look at some examples and see what these lenses can do. Jenny, what have you got for us?
I've got some lovely portraits here. This one in particular was shot on the 50mm 1.4 lens.
Yeah, it's a really nice portrait. I mean, that sort of sums up the sort of image you might get with the 50mm. It's more spontaneous, a little closer in, and there's quite a lot of energy there. It's just caught her eyes. And people often say if you can focus on the eyes in a portrait, everything else you can let do what you want to do. If the eyes are sharp, that's the shot.
Again, on another 50mm lens.
Okay, I think on this one we're looking at the 1.2, so even faster. I think one thing that's worth noting about working with a 50 here is by stepping back a little further, depth of field's increased, even though this is obviously still on its, probably on its widest aperture, and it's let the photographer work in available light. This is somewhere you may find too dark to work with a slower lens, or you might have to work at higher ISOs. That maximum aperture really helps. The other thing I like about this is using a 50 here. It's more of an environmental portrait. We're including a bit more about the guy and it's telling a bit more of a story. So it's a really lovely shot.
This one's moving to the longer lens, the 85 1.2.
Okay, and I think, you know, that shows, doesn't it? The photographers step back a little bit. We've got that more condensed perspective. It's a slightly more formal shot, like you might expect from the slightly longer lens. But again, amazing the way it's caught all that, and that lens, such a big aperture, and it can resolve incredible detail.
This was shot on the zoom lens, the 17 to 55. This is a focal length of about 24mm.
So it's on an APS-C camera, so the 24 equates to a little bit longer with the crop factor. It's a nice kind of natural portrait, again, letting in a lot of light. And the thing about that zoom lens, it actually has a fixed aperture. It's fixed at f2.8. It's one less thing for us to think about. We can move around, get these images. It lets us work in a more spontaneous way.
This is on the longer lens, the 135mm lens.
I think this is a beautiful lens. It's a 135 f2, often popular with fashion and beauty. but look how it renders the image, the way the light interplays off her skin and that background. It's a nice handling of that light.
And then we move to this image, which was shot on the 100mm macro lens. Slightly unconventional maybe for a portrait, but I think it still makes a really amazing image.
Yeah, and I think actually that 100mm macro lens makes a really great portrait lens, which is great because we've bought a lens maybe for its close-up ability, but we've got a portrait lens as well, so there's some flexibility there. I think the other thing that it does is it really draws the photographer in. It makes that interesting crop because they can be a little bit further away and tighter in, and that crop draws us into some detail and very finely resolved detail in here. It's interesting that we don't have to stick to a lens's maybe intended use. We might have bought a 24mm for landscape, but we could experiment with shooting portraiture with it. There aren't really any rules, maybe some advice and some guidance. Portraiture is not just about recording a face, it communicates something, maybe character, emotion, a moment, and choosing our lens is a really important part of telling that story.